There are several ways to create contrast in a drawing. But before we learn that, you need to make sure you have learned how to block in the drawing or draw the basic outlines of the shapes of the objects. You can use a light table or a window to trace onto large paper, or you can block in the drawing by measuring intuitively. Once the initial outlines are drawn in, it's time to create the value or contrast. As we learned earlier, there are 5 value techniques you can use to create value in a drawing. For this drawing, value is not required, but if you know how to do it, you could create value in any of these ways to create contrast between the objects so each object is easily visible in the artwork. You can also use the pen and ink handout to find additional ways to create value, texture, and pattern that will help create contrast between objects. This handout is in the composition module in Canvas. Regardless of what you intend to do, you should practice on a separate piece of paper so you can troubleshoot any problems that might arise as you work. In the example I created for blocking in a drawing, I decided to use an ultrafine Sharpie marker and chalk pastel to create the contrast in the piece. After I outlined the original blocked-in drawing, I created small circles in the background to create contrast against the completely white glasses. Creating those circles became tiresome, so I took a break and started creating diagonal lines in the table the glasses were on. As I did this, I wasn't paying attention to the direction of the lines well enough, and the lines went slightly in a different direction at the end. Rather than get upset about this, I then used a light blue pastel in the same area, which pretty much covered up that mistake. As I was working in pastel, I used a piece of paper to keep areas I wanted to keep white totally clean. I originally put the pastel on the paper with the smaller edge of the pastel in order to get the edges of the objects outlined. I then used the larger side of the pastel to put more of the media on the paper. After there was pastel in the whole area, I used my fingers to blend it together so it looks smooth. Noticing that my fingers were getting quite full of pastel, I washed my hands in the middle of the project in order to keep areas that I wanted white clean. For the area in between the glasses, I slowed down to carefully fill in the area and then used the blending stump from the toolkit to smooth the pastel together so the entire background looked the same. When I felt like the pastel was finished, I went back into the drawing and erased any areas where the pastel got on the glasses. After that was done, I went back to do more small circles in the background and took another break when my hand got tired. During that break, I created another set of diagonal lines in the part of the glass reflection that separates the real glasses from the reflection. I also put those lines in the top of the glasses where the liquid would go so you can see the difference between the inside and outside of the glasses. Once that was done, I finished the drawing by completing the small circles in the background. This is one way to create contrast, but there are many more in the examples that follow and in other projects that you will create. Here you can see someone used cross-hatching and line rendering to create an image of Woody from Disney's Toy Story. While it is technically a well-done drawing and it has enough contrast for you to see each area, it is a copy of someone else's work or an infringement on copyright law. You can be fined for using other people's work without permission, so it's best to use your own photos. The next few images will show you some information about contrast. In the first image here, you are able to see the umbrella because the individual made parts of the umbrella thicker, allowing your eye to see the difference between the darker, thicker areas creating the umbrella and the thinner lines of the background. A similar situation is happening in this musical example, except the piano keys in the background are also going a different direction than the swirl in the foreground. Additionally, the swirl has a thicker line defining it, which allows your eye to see the two areas differently. The next example has a very small amount of color, but it's just enough to tell the difference between the apple and the rays in the background. This watch has more color in the background, allowing you to see the watch better. However, there are areas on the top and the bottom of the watch that show the artist's fingerprints, and you can obviously tell that was a mistake. This is an obvious craftsmanship flaw that could have been avoided by placing a piece of scrap paper over the drawing as the person worked. While this next example is pretty well done, There could have been more pen added to the background closest to the area next to the face so that there is more contrast between the face and the background. Color would have helped as well, but since the artist wanted to use only one color in the piece, the background needed more pen to distinguish it from the face. This rose is a great example of contrast and craftsmanship, but could have been designed better in the rule of thirds, and is why we create thumbnail sketches to make sure all the requirements of an assignment are evident before starting the final piece. This last example is just simple shapes and has enough contrast between all the objects, but could have had a ball that was red or more solid to create an obvious area of emphasis in order to earn more credit. If you plan to use ebony pencil, colored pencil, or pastel in this drawing and don't know how to do that, you can watch the video tutorials in the 2D video tutorials section in Canvas. You just have to scroll down to find the type of video you want to see. There are several about chalk pastel, colored pencil, and value that you could watch. In the interest of saving time, ask your instructor for advice on what video to watch, as there are hours worth of video tutorials in that document.